Thanks for listening to the FU Cancer Podcast. My name is Christina Rollins. I'm a dietitian, mom, and wife to a pretty awesome cancer survivor. We said FU to cancer nearly 25 years ago and are still going strong. I'm excited to share the FU Cancer movement, where we are a community of survivors, fighters, caregivers, and advocates, connecting our shared experiences, passion, and determination to live a holistic and well-balanced life. Stay tuned, because we've got a lot to talk about. Hey everyone, welcome back to the FU Cancer Podcast. Today we're diving into life after cancer treatment, exploring the emotional and physical challenges that come after treatment ends. Joining me is Meghan Laszlo, an oncology registered dietitian, advocate, and powerful voice for the survivor community. Meghan's story is sharing one of strength, vulnerability, and hope, reminding us that surviving cancer isn't just about getting through treatment, but about rebuilding life, finding balance, and discovering a renewed purpose using health and wellness. Meghan, thank you so much for being here at FU Cancer.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with your journey. What inspired you to work with cancer survivors as an oncology specialized dietitian?
Yeah, I was working in oncology nutrition for many years before I was asked by Dr. Arash Asher to start cooking classes as part of Cedars-Sinai's Wellness, Resilience, and Survivorship programs. And at that time, we were fortunate enough to inherit a kitchen from occupational therapy and start there. So we had a space to do cooking classes. And so the idea was like, let's use this space. And it started really with cooking classes. And I found that this was a great opportunity not only to use some of the skills that I had gained from being a line cook and working in restaurants for a very long time, but I have an interest in really bridging the gap between treatment-focused nutrition services that are being provided in the clinic and the general survivorship info that's given. And I think that there are really great resources out there like the American Institute for Cancer Research, and patients weren't being made aware of it. And I have this very strong desire to offer evidence-based nutrition information in a very practical how-to format. So when we do hands-on cooking classes, patients can see how to implement these recommendations and really set aside the time to learn the why behind the recommendation and then the how-to. And we really want to emphasize how to make healthful changes easy, flavorful, cost-effective, and sustainable. And I think that then when there's a solid recommendation, like trying to consume 30 grams of fiber per day, that's something to focus on and come back to.
When we talk about quote unquote survivorship, what does that mean nutritionally and emotionally for someone who has just completed treatment?
You know, the word survivorship has a range of interpretations. You know, for some, a survivor is someone that has had a cancer diagnosis and is still alive. You know, for others, it's this recovery time after treatment ends. And it's often seen as a stage of time after cancer treatment. You know, maybe it's a short stage of time, maybe it's a long stage of time. You know, I think it's comparable to the fourth trimester after pregnancy. It's this recovery space where the main event has ended, you know, the baby's been born or the treatment is over, but there's still recovery time that's needed. And I think even with pregnancy, you know, as a mom of twins, this idea that that only lasts 3 months isn't accurate, you know, and I think for individuals that have been through oncology treatment, there's not a set time period for what survivorship is. And I think when you compare completing cancer treatment to other large events that require so much of you, such as like giving birth or training and finishing a triathlon, there's this period of recovery that's really necessary. And I think that there can be a letdown after a big event, even if it's a positive event like a triathlon. But when it's over, you may not know what to do next, where to focus your energy on after so much attention and energy has been spent on finishing. And I think for, you know, emotionally, I've heard a range of things from feeling lost, feeling isolated, that others don't understand what you've been through and can't relate to it. I hear sometimes that folks feel like everyone else is on planet Earth and they're on planet, I just finished cancer treatment. And there's a lack of relation that can happen there. But I think that there's an opportunity for redirection from surviving to thriving in this space, even if those are words that not everyone resonates with. And for nutrition, I think it's a solid opportunity to really focus on healing, recovering, starting or restarting healthy habits, potentially after some of the barriers to good nutrition have been removed, such as like side effects from chemotherapy.
Well, I think when people think about cancer treatment, they think, like you said, the hardest part ends when the treatment is completed. But we know that survivorship can bring its own new and unique challenges. So, what are some of the unexpected struggles that you coach others through once they have moved into that survivorship period or that next stage in their cancer journey?
It's such a wide variety, but there are both short and long-term effects from treatment. And I think, every person will have their own experience. What I hear most often is that it takes longer than expected. I don't think some individuals realize, that there are side effects from hormone therapy, and they may not be anticipating that. The general population is so aware of some of the side effects from chemotherapy, but when you look at these other therapies that could be implemented for a decade, most folks just aren't aware of that. And I think I also work with individuals that have been through head and neck cancer treatment, and I think just the recovery time is something that isn't well understood, and that it may take someone 6 months to eat solid food again, after going through radiation to your tongue. And there's a long period of recovery where you do need a good bit of support through that. And I think folks are often looking for that feeling of normalcy or finding the spring in their step. And that can be really challenging because you're still dealing with the weight of your experience. And I think that brings up a lot of existential and emotional and relational issues that do need support and may benefit from working with a social worker or a chaplain or programming that's really focused on supporting individuals that are in this recovery space.
Well, we know that many survivors face fear of recurrent disease, right? So you've moved into that survivorship, but what if it comes back? So very careful and very, I think, just scared about what could be in the future. So can you share how nutrition can really empower survivors without creating additional anxiety or guilt around their food choices?
That's a challenge, but I think that working with a registered dietitian and getting informed on current research surrounding one specific cancer diagnosis can be empowering. There's so much bad information out there, but it's important to learn from the experts that can discern between quality research and poor quality research or just bad advice. There's a lot of potential value in working someone that can provide both factual and practical information. And that's what registered dietitians are experts at, holding both the practical and the factual in both hands. And new studies are coming out all the time that are showing an enormous benefit of good nutrition and exercise after diagnosis. For example, there was a recent article from the New England Journal of Medicine that demonstrated that exercise reduced stage 3 colorectal cancer recurrence. And the more exercise, the greater the risk reduction. And prior research has also shown that adherence to the American Cancer Society guidelines reduces risk of occurrence in early stage colorectal cancer. And I think when you know specifically what to work on, it's empowering. It's empowering not to be guessing what to do and following tips when what we really need is guidance. And I think when you work with someone, it's helpful to set realistic and specific goals for yourself and seek support to achieve these goals. And I think observationally, there's less anxiety when there's a clear plan. And I really reject this idea of like everything in moderation, because we hear that a lot in nutrition. Oh, just everything in moderation. But when you don't define what moderation is, it's really meaningless. And I think that creates a lot of anxiety. And I do like to give clear, specific information because I find that folks really do benefit from it. I don't pressure anyone in my consults and really look to support and just develop solutions that can help individuals reach their goals. And I think it's just important to start where you are and not have overly strict expectations for yourself and just go from there.
Can you talk a little bit more about the emotional relationship with food after cancer and how clinicians in particular can support survivors in healing that relationship?
The relationship with food can be so dynamic throughout treatment. There can be smell aversion, taste changes, this idea of you're eating just to live. eating just to maintain your weight. There could be someone that's fasting. You could be eating for a purpose. Um, and I think all of those ideas can be really transient throughout treatment and can really shift how we see food and what it is for us, and what it is to us. But I think, in working with individuals, it's important to ask the consented, thoughtful questions that can bring this discussion to the table. Asking how someone feels about eating and what they identify as their relationship to food and how it's changed through treatment can kind of help you discern where to go next as a clinician. And sometimes another layer of support can be helpful. Maybe there is a need for more emotional support outside of nutritional counseling. Maybe there's a need to work with a therapist or a social worker as well.
So we know, and like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of misinformation available. So, what are some of the common myths or misconceptions that you hear about anti-cancer diets in particular? And then how do you address them with your clients?
There's so many. I could only begin to highlight a few, but I really can't underscore the importance of being aware of these different myths or misconceptions. And as an oncology dietitian, and my experience is really to address these head on. First, by identifying the theory behind it. The goals of the intervention. Whether or not there's any research to support it or not, because I think that's very important. And then assess if there's any risk of harm. For some nutrition theory, there is no risk of harm to eat more fruits and vegetables. I wouldn't dissuade anyone from doing something like that. But I think there's the value in the discussion of what is being considered and whether or not it's appropriate. Some of these ideas are something like no sugar. And what does that mean for somebody? Does it mean no added sugar? Does it mean no fruit? Does it mean no carbs, no starch? And really asking the questions of like, oh, well, what does that mean to you, and trying to understand what it is. If I'm working with someone that just doesn't want to eat added sugar, I don't take issue with that. It really just depends. Other ideas are, vegan diets, alkaline diets, eat for your blood type. I mean, there's so many, but I think it's important to look at the theory behind it and really talk it through with someone. And if there is risk of harm from a particular intervention, for example, let's say someone's malnourished, they're interested in pursuing a fasting mimicking diet, there's risk for malnutrition, I would dissuade them and I would, talk about why. But I think that there's an opportunity to appeal to someone's motivation in these circumstances and really using that motivation to follow an alternative diet, use that motivation to use diet as a way to improve their health, and then redirect, if appropriate, to evidence-based dietary choices.
How can caregivers and loved ones best support a survivor's nutritional and emotional recovery without being perceived as overbearing or pushing their own food beliefs onto someone else?
Now, I usually suggest leading with questions rather than advice or information. I think if someone wants to talk about their, it's important to ask if someone wants to talk about their food choices, and maybe ask about their approach to life after oncology treatment. Ask if they want support and how they would like to be supported. Ask if they want to be accompanied to their appointments or future scans. Do they want to celebrate their cancer treatment milestones, and what does that look like for them? I think you can also ask what someone doesn't want, because that can be just as valuable as knowing what someone does want. Possibly there's specific words or terms that are bothersome, like cancer battle or fight, or what have you. And not everyone resonates well with like the warrior rhetoric. I think if you identify a resource that you think someone would like, ask permission before you share it with them. I think it's important to be considerate of how someone feels about their own experience and respect their wishes to talk about it or not talk about it.
I love that you bring up kind of some of those buzzwords that we hear in cancer care. I know another word that's tossed around a lot is resilience. So, can you talk about resilience and what that really means for someone who is going through cancer and going into that post treatment phase?
Like so many of these other words, it's very individualized and can hold some power for some individuals, and for some, I think, if they don't feel that they are resilient, it can be disempowering. But I think resilience is something, that you build upon, and going through tough things like oncology treatment can make you more resilient. Um, but I'm careful with that word, and it's something that I would really ask somebody for what it means for them. I think it's something that we want to support by providing, information and guidance and tools. But really, it comes down to, how someone's feeling when they go through difficult times.
Now, Megan, you're highly involved in the cancer space, teaching post-treatment wellness, resilience, and survivorship classes. And I know that you've developed and led a cooking and nutrition education program called Nutrition in the Kitchen, along with your lecture series, One Bite at a Time, Emerging Insights in Survivorship Nutrition. So, how has working with cancer survivors changed your own outlook on health, relationships, and even your own personal health goals?
Today it's estimated that 40% of cancer cases are preventable through diet and exercise. And while I think that statistic can be motivating, I think it goes to show that there's also bad luck. So for me, my approach to my health and, you know, how I approach nutrition and how much activity I do is not strict. I do not like to be extremely strict with my food choices. I like to follow guidance that have some wiggle room, and because I don't find a benefit from that personally. It just doesn't suit my personality. So I think it's good to have the information and use it and be knowledgeable of it and just have some wiggle room. And I think with the way that working in oncology has really shaped my outlook on life is, I think about this phrase that a lot of my friends use. Friends that work in end of life care and clinicians that work in the emergency department and hospice agencies. And it's this phrase that says like, "Yay, we're alive." And sometimes this phrase just gets tossed back between friends. And I think it's so lovely because it's just this just moment of gratitude of like, "Yay, we're alive." We all work very close to death in our careers, and I think that has really shaped that for me. And it's really, I think it's so important to just take that moment and acknowledge that you're alive, that maybe you have good mobility, maybe you feel good, maybe you woke up with good energy, and just acknowledging that and being appreciative of it. And I know that I am, and that working in oncology makes me appreciate it every day, that I wake up feeling okay. And yeah, I mean, I think it shapes everything. For me personally, it just really changes my whole outlook on life. But I find so much value in really being able to present good, solid information to individuals so that they can do what they can with it.
Well, for our listeners who are in that survivorship period now, maybe they've just finished treatment and they're feeling overwhelmed, what advice would you give them?
Similar advice to what I'd give someone that was just starting treatment. It's take it one day at a time, be gentle on yourself. It takes time. You are not alone. Find other people in the same place that you are, collaborate with them, find connection. I think there's so much value in being understood without having to explain yourself, and being in those settings where you can find that. Whether I see that in our cooking classes, in our small groups. I see people being able to connect with one another, and I think it really eases the struggle of that transition to not have to explain so much. You're in to find yourself in a group with other people that have a shared experience can be really connecting, and I think that can be of a service to you if that feels right.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for sharing your story and your insights with us. You really paint a great picture of cancer survivorship and that definition of resilience. So thank you for all of that. What final message or piece of advice would you offer someone who's navigating survivorship and looking to reclaim their health and identity?
I think it's important to reach out for support, and that can be in different forms. It doesn't mean a support group, and that's one of the reasons why I see value in the cooking class beyond just nutrition. I think finding support is really, really important and can really help you feel understood. And that's the main thing, I think.
Wonderful. Well, Meghan, again, thank you so much for coming up, joining us today at FU Cancer. Your clinical lens is a great reminder that survivorship is a lifelong process. There's small victories and there's room for powerful growth. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, whether you're navigating treatment, adjusting to life after cancer, or you're supporting someone who's going through it, please know you're not alone. We have a variety of resources within our community, fucancer.health, so we encourage you to check it out. Until next time, I'm Christina Rollins. Thanks for listening.